Hello and Yalimudat. My name is Ahmed Chagani and I'm the Executive Officer for ITREB USA, and I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging that the land on which I reside is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Kiowa, and Wichita nations of the Houston area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders, both past and present. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our continuous responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to indigenous peoples on these lands and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping our ethics as Shia Imam Ismaili Muslims. As we head into the holy month of Ramadan, a time to seek closeness to Allah, a time for deep reflection about our connection to faith and community, we wanted to situate today's critical conversation around the topic of the clash of ignorances and religious literacy. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the importance of religious literacy in an age of polarization and misinformation. Understanding conflicting claims made in the name of religion, specifically Islam, and the dangers of religious illiteracy and the single dimensional categorization of human beings. During this session, on your screen, you will also see a question and answer box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let's move to our panelist, who is a distinguished scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and a friend. It is my distinct honor and pleasure in introducing our wonderful panelist, Dr. Ali Asani. Dr. Ali Asani is a Murray A. Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University. Dr. Asani has recently appointed to the Institute of Ismaili Studies Board of Governors, chairing the academic committee. A specialist of Islam in South Asia, he teaches a variety of courses related to Islam and Muslim cultures at Harvard, including multisensory religion, rethinking Islam through the arts, and Kawaki Sufiana Kalam, and the Ginan's Muslim devotional literatures of South Asia. For several decades, he has been active in improving the understanding of Islam and its role in Muslim societies by conducting workshops for educators, as well as making presentations at various public forums. He has been involved in the Islamic Cultural Studies Initiative, an international professional development program for high school teachers in Kenya, Pakistan, and the United States of America, intended to promote a culturally and historically based approach to the study of Islam and Muslim societies. He has also served on the American Academy of Religion's task force on the teaching of religion in schools and as a consultant for the National Endowment for the Humanities Bridging Cultures Muslims Journeys Bookshelf Project. He is a recipient of the Harvard Foundation Medal for his outstanding contribution to improving intercultural and race relations and the Petra C. Shattuck Prize for Excellence in Teaching for Harvard's Division of Continuing Education. In 2020, he was named the Harvard Foundation's Faculty of the Year for his efforts at making Harvard a more inclusive institution. At the outset, we would like to note that the views expressed during the course of this discussion by myself and the speaker are our own. Let's now turn to our presentation. Welcome, Dr. Asani.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for this invitation and your warm welcome. I'm delighted to share my thoughts on these topics, and I just thought that in terms of getting our conversation going, that maybe I should just lay out some key concepts and ideas about what I mean by religious literacy. This phrase, clash of ignorances, where is it coming from? What is the context? And so how do these two actually relate to one another? So I have a very short PowerPoint presentation to explain this concept. So I'll start with that. I'll share some slides, and then after a while I'll stop, and then we can continue the conversation. So
thank you, Dr.
All right. Okay, I can see the screen. Everything's okay? Good, yeah. All right, so I wanted to start first because of the nature of these conversations, these critical conversations, is why is, because we talk about literacy and we're really talking about education. And one of the purposes of education is, in fact, I would say, to equip, inspire, and empower citizens to use their moral agency to promote justice and peaceful existence. So of course, people can define the role of education in many different ways, but I think this is one of the primary goals, the empowerment. And it's within that context, I wanted to introduce, first of all, this idea of religious literacy and its converse, religious illiteracy, by talking about the context in which I actually encountered this, and that is in the work of Diane Moore, who's a very close friend of mine, who's head of the Religion in Public Life program at Harvard Divinity School, but also was involved in the Religious Literacy Project. And she and I had a wonderful experience working in the Islamic Cultural Studies Initiative, which you talked about, which connected schools in Texas and actually Arkan schools in Kenya and also in Pakistan on this idea of religious and cultural literacy. And so that was really an initiative of the AKDN. In any case, so that's how I encountered Diane. And one of the interesting things about when you get involved in this work on religious illiteracy, there are three sort of premises that come to the fore. One is that this illiteracy, what we're talking about, this religious, is global, and that one of the most sort of troubling aspects of it, this religious literacy, is the consequences, the prejudice, the antagonism that it promotes, and it hinders all kinds of efforts. So to promote pluralism, coexistence, and so on, are hindered very often by religious illiteracy. And the third premise is that it is possible to diminish this religious illiteracy by teaching about religion from a non-sectarian perspective. It says here primary and secondary school, but I would actually add that this is a lifelong thing. It's not, Diane Moore talks about it in the context of primary and secondary schools, but I would actually say it's a lifelong endeavor. So it's part of continuing education. So I think, I just want to share with you what I would say are manifestations of religious illiteracy, basically how not to think about religion. So the first premise is that very often people equate religion with devotional practices, rites, rituals, ceremonies. So they think that's what religion is about. And that's certainly the case. However, religion is much more complicated than that, as we will see, because these rites, rituals, and ceremonies are actually situated in different contexts. And what just equating religion with devotional practice doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the nature of religion. You might understand a particular ritual, but you don't understand the context in which the ritual emerged, and so on and so forth. Another sort of categorization, another characteristic of religious illiteracy is that very often religion is perceived as being located in sacred texts. So Islam is what the Qur'an says, or Christianity is what the Bible says. So it somehow says that religion is connected with text. And actually, when you study this, you see this is a very, not a very accurate representation of how religion operates in human societies. Yes, there are sacred texts that people, use to construct their ideas. But what is important is that these texts don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in political, social, and cultural settings, so that a person reading the Quran in one context will give a very different reading to it than another individual who is in another context. So for instance, you can have, some people can read the Quran as a text that is promoting peace, and other people can read the Quran as a text that is promoting violence. So it's not really about the text itself, it's about the person who's interpreting the text and the context that they're in. So if you start equating texts and religion, you're actually missing out the important fact that these texts don't exist in a vacuum. So we always need to contextualize any interpretations of Islam or of any religion that are based on text. Another manifestation is that religious traditions are seen as timeless and unchanging and monolithic, that Islam was born, what somebody's called the cocoon theory of Islamic civilization, that Islam was, the development of Islam, the Islamic tradition, or Christianity, or Buddhism, these all emerged just the way we have them, and there's no acknowledgement that there was actually a process of historical development. And also the fact that there is diversity in any religious tradition. It's as if like saying all Hindus believe the same thing, or all Muslims believe the same thing. And actually the reality is that it's not the case. We all know religious traditions are marked by intense diversity and intense, sometimes polarizations. So different people in a different tradition, in the same tradition, can see things in a very different way. The other most common manifestation of religious literacy is religions are seen as actors, as if religions say and do things. Of how often, people will say, well, according to Islam, or Islam says, or but religions don't say or do anything. They are imagined concepts, they're ideas, and it's people who do things or say things in the name of religion. So religions are not people. People do things in the name of religion, and the motivations and their interpretations of how they see religion or understand Islam or Christianity is again located in their context. So, when people say, well, Islam oppresses women, I would say it's not Islam oppressing women, it is men with patriarchal interpretations of Islam that are oppressing women. It is or some, you could take any statement like that and say who, it's not religion per se. The other characteristic is that very often people use religion as an exclusive lens to explain the actions of somebody. Very common to find, for instance, if a Muslim happens to do something, oh, it's the religion made that person do this. It's not recognizing the fact that an individual has many other identities to themselves, not just their religion. They have a political identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, and so on and so forth. And so how can we pinpoint religion as something that was the sole identity marker that led them to do something? So that's the problem of trying to think about religion, the using religion as an exclusive lens to explain what an individual does. And similarly, it is a sign of religious illiteracy that an entire religious community is held responsible for the actions of a few. And I don't need to tell this audience about how this works in the case of Islam, right? So everyone's responsible for anything, any crazy thing that somebody does in Islam. Well, you're all responsible for it. It's a height of religious illiteracy. It doesn't recognize that, the agencies of individual and so on. Now, some of the dangers of religious illiteracy, which I wanted to highlight, that first of all, if you do not, if you're afraid and ignorant of your neighbors who are religiously different than you, and you don't understand where they're coming from, democracy cannot function because it diminishes respect for diversity, but more importantly, it leads to the emergence of stereotypes and ultimately dehumanization. All Muslims are like this, or all Christians are like this. And by the way, I'm talking about religion, but this could apply to race, or this could apply to ethnicity, right? I'm just using religion because that's what we are talking about here. And that dehumanization has also a very serious consequences, and Amartya Sen has done much work about this, talks about how the single-dimensional categorization of human beings combines with the haziness of vision and creates an increased scope for exploitation of that haze by champions of violence. So this can actually lead to a lot of violence. And we can see, whether we're talking about the Rohingyas in Myanmar, or we're talking about the Uyghurs in China and so on, they've all been lumped under this notion of, oh, they're all Muslim, though they're of different ethnicities. You can see how violence takes place. So take the Holocaust with lots of examples where people, single-dimensional categorization can be harmful. It also leads to this kind of marginalization that takes place, can lead to radicalization. And finally, I would say that religious illiteracy can also be exploited to promote forms of extremism and fundamentalism. Now, let's move to this clash of ignorances that Hazimam talks about over and over again. And this is in response to this formulation of this clash of civilizations theory, which is premised on the notion that religious traditions form a primary marker of world civilizations. So there's an Islamic and a Buddhist and a Hindu and so on civilization, and that these civilizations actually hold different values because their religious traditions are different. They hold different values, and because they hold different values, when through globalization and so on, they come to encounter each other, or as countries or nations become more diverse, there's going to be inevitably a clash of civilizations, and it's going to lead to instability. And one of the proponents of this was Samuel Huntington, and I've just here a quote from his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. And you can see the way he portrays Islam Islam's borders are bloody and so are its innards. And the fundamental problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism. It's Islam, whose people are convinced of superiority of their culture and are obsessed with inferiority of the power. He's sort of talking really about that Islam is all about power, and it's all about a people who have been displaced from power, and it's all about them trying to assert their superiority against what they think is another world power, the West. Now, this is highly problematic. It's, in a way, I think it's racist from many perspectives. It's full of stereotypes. It shows deep lack of understanding of Islam. You can see the classic symptoms of religious illiteracy right here. Samuel Huntington may have been a professor of government at Harvard, but I'm sorry, he never studied world religions. He did not have religious literacy. Otherwise, he would have not made such a statement. So religious illiteracy is not connected to the fact how educated you are. You need to be educated how you think about religion. And problematic in this, that there's a monolithic category, Islam in a monolithic West. What are we talking about as a monolithic West? The West is incredibly diverse. There's United States and Canada and Europe and Britain and so on, and they're all very different. So how can you even lump them all together and say that this is the West? In any case, it's really in response to this kind of formulation that Hazimam has said that these symptoms that you're talking about are in fact rooted in human ignorance rather than in human character, and that the problem here is human ignorance. That when people formulate things like this, they're based on illiteracy, and I'm connecting that human ignorance that he's talking about to this notion of illiteracy. So what is a more responsible way of thinking about religion as a phenomena in human society? So I would say that here is one of the methods that is used to talk about religion is that, first of all, you never think about religion as existing in a vacuum, that anything connected with religion, whether you're talking about rites, rituals, ceremonies, conceptualizations of key notions, everything is deeply embedded in all dimensions of human experience. That is, religious ideas, concepts, institutions are complexly embedded in historical, political, economic, social, literary, artistic, all kinds of contexts. And therefore, you require multiple lenses to understand the nature of religion. And that also, that because these contexts, the historical, political, economic, and so on contexts are constantly changing, ideas about religion are changing. So ideas about religion are dynamic, they're not stuck or solidified. Very often people like to think that they are, but actually they're not. They're always changing. And so a religiously literate person would be able to differentiate between devotional, like faith perspective, which very often tend to be monolithic and so on and so forth, or sectarian, and actually studying about religion using the tools of the humanities and social sciences. So there's a difference between studying religion from a faith perspective as opposed to studying about religion. A religiously literate person always will think about religions as internally diverse as opposed to being uniform, and is always aware that there are multiple perspectives, and some might call themselves orthodox and normative, and then they declare others to be heretic and so on, but to recognize that there are these diversities and that religions are evolving and changing, and that that in order to understand religion, you have to, these understandings or interpretations of religion, you have to situate them, because very often they are connected with issues of power and powerlessness. And I will come back again to how this works. So, so for instance, I would say, let's look, for instance, how the word Islam and Muslim are seen today. Very often we think about Islam as the name of a religion, and we think about Muslim as somebody who follows that religion. Now, and you think about Islam as a defined ideology. However, when you go back to the 7th century and looking at what you have in the Quran, you find actually Islam is rarely used as a name of a religion. It's actually, it just means submission. It's an act of faith. And Muslim is a person of faith, and it's very often connected to this notion of mu'min, as a believer, those who believe in the one God and those who don't. And what is interesting in that category is that the Quran is very emphatic that the Ahlul Kitab and the prophets, you know, these are all submitters to God. They're all Muslim. So Jews, Christians, and so on are in the category of mu'min, believers. And the criticism in the Quran is talking about the believers, which includes Jews and Christians, as opposed to the non-believers in the one God. And initially in that early period, what was important, what is it that that brought all these believers in one God, in monotheism together, was the single Shahada, La ilaha illallah, which is what the Quran emphasizes over and over and over again. So we find, therefore, when people are translating the Quran, and here's just an example, Muhammad Asad claims that when we translate the Quran, we have to keep in mind that this was the original meaning of the term. And this is how actually the Prophet Muhammad understood the term. And these later institutionalized forms that Islam is the name of a religion come back much later, and therefore should be avoided in Quran translation. Because if you try to apply it to Quran translation, you run into problems. For instance, here's this Quranic verse, which says that, you know, we believe in one God, and how then he talks about Abraham, Ismail, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Jesus. We make no distinction. It calls them all Muslim. It's using the Arabic term Muslim. Now, you have to translate the term Muslim as submitters, because if you translate it as Muslims, those who follow the religion of Islam, that's not how the Quran is using this term. So what is interesting is that in the 8th century, you start seeing a shift in the meaning of this term, Islam and Muslim. It goes from being a very inclusive term to being a more exclusive term. And this is tied to the rise of Umayyad imperial power, where they're using Quranic terms and so on to promote, to legitimize their power. And Fred Donner has done some work on this, put in this work. So that what you see is the emergence of the double Shahada. To the Shahada is added this phrase, Muhammad Rasulullah. And you can see through coins and so on. Now, the emergence of the double Shahada is interesting because it's now distinguishing the followers of the Prophet Muhammad from the Jews and the Christians. And why is this happening? Because there is under the Umayyads, there's this rise of this imperialism, and imperial powers always like to say we are superior to those whom we are ruling. So as a way to assert their superiority, the Umayyads actually use this double Shahada to say, because we are the superior religion, we were the Prophet Muhammad was the last and he's the best, and so forth, we have the right to rule, as a form of political triumphalism. And so Jews and Christians are become protected minorities. So you can see the shift that happens over time when you start applying this method of religious literacy. So the questions that religious literacy asks us to think, which Islam are we talking about? Whose Islam are we talking about? In which context? And drawing on what basis of authority? And that religion itself can never be used as in isolation as a factor of explanation. We always have to very carefully situate it within different contexts. So I'll stop here, but just as an illustration of this method and how we can think about religion in a more complex way.
No, absolutely, Dr. Asani. What a powerful introduction. You shared some interesting thoughts on the relationship between, clash of ignorance, a phrase that Maulana Hazir Imam often refers to, and the notion of religious literacy. You have kindly invited us, I must say, to reflect within on our worldviews, how we speak, how we study about world religions, how do we think, how do we articulate, how do we interpret? And I mean, are we perpetuating the problem or are we exercising religious literacy? The journey, as you've rightfully said, for religious literacy, like any other form of education, is ongoing. Are we careful and thoughtful in the questions we ask? You share the concept of rooting notions of religion within cultural contexts and differentiating between concepts found in primary texts, such as the Holy Quran. For example, Muslim with the uppercase M versus the lowercase m, or Islam with the uppercase I versus the lowercase I. Can you elaborate more about these ideas? And why is it important to have an understanding of diverse ways that concepts can be interpreted?
I'd be happy to. Let me again share my screen. I believe I have another slide that would illustrate this well. So if you take this, this example of Muslim as somebody who submits to God, and the Quran talks about the Ahlul Kitab, that they are amongst the righteous, and that Abraham, Noah, Moses, Jesus are highly venerated figures for Muslims, that we actually share religious histories and heroes with Jews and Christians, and that they're just as meaningful for us as they are for them. We may not think about Jesus as the incarnation of God or the Son of God, but nevertheless, Jesus is a very important figure in Islam. It's so when people start talking about, well, Christians and Jews are infidels, there's a problem there because the Quran doesn't see them as infidels at all. That is not the view that the Prophet had on this issue. So it definitely then tells us that these clash of civilizations is obviously unaware of the ways in which these traditions like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, which we today imagine in conflicting ways, they actually share the same roots in not only the Abrahamic traditions, but also in Greek and Roman culture, taking ideas from Greek and Roman culture. So, and that the roots of what is Islam are the same as the roots of the Jewish and Christian tradition. So this has a great impact on how you see Christians and Jews. They're not the other as it's commonly imagined. They're actually somebody with whom theologically and ethically and morally you have a lot of things in common. And here I've just put in the slide of the shrine of John the Baptist in this Umayyad mosque in Damascus, which goes back, to the very early history of Islam. And this John the Baptist, a very important figure in the development of Christianity, is in fact for Muslims, Prophet Yahya. People are aware that, in the Quran, it talks about God has sent messengers to all peoples, to all nations, and so on. So Prophet Yahya, John the Baptist is interpreted as Prophet Yahya. So today you find Christians as well as Muslims come to the same shrine. And interestingly, the shrine is located right in the middle of a mosque, which tells you something about, the character of Islam in this very early period, where in fact there was a great deal of sharing of traditions, and these kinds of ideological boundaries that we see today are very often a product of nationalism. These are not, or sometimes imperialism, but they're not intrinsically theological, at least from a Muslim perspective. I would also say that when you start thinking about who's a believer and who's not a believer, again, the Quran is very, very clear about that, anyone who believes in God, the prophets, the angels, and notice it's all the prophets, it's not limited just to the Prophet Muhammad. And the book is actually this universal scripture from which the Quran, the Torah, the Injil, they all come from the same book. People who are engaged in social justice work, helping the poor, the sick, the needy, and people who are upright and pious, that these are the truthful. And it's not limiting the category of righteousness to just the followers of the Prophet Muhammad. Very important to keep in mind, because right now they're exclusivist interpretations of Islam, and also that promote a kind of superiority, which actually is not there in the Quran. So that's important. And I also think it's very important for us to think about how we relate to other Muslim communities. So for instance, we will see that notions of authority, we have different communities of interpretation within Islam. We have Sunni and Shia and so on. And we all have our institutions of authority, and who should be after the Prophet, who should have the right to interpret, lead the community, what should be the scope of their authority, and so on and so forth. But we should realize that ultimately what unites us, notwithstanding the disagreements about authority, is the figure of the Prophet Muhammad, because he's the figure of unification. And all these institutions of authority are ultimately drawing on the same figure. So that helps us think about how we even relate. What does this mean for intra-Muslim relations? What is it that we have in common, and what is it that how are we different? So these are just some sort of ideas that I had, in trying to talk about the implications for this approach for our present day world.
This is amazing, amazing. I think what's really insightful as you're discussing this is that as we're using examples of Islam and Muslim, that it is embedded within the ethics of our faith, that it's a responsibility that we engage in this practice of religious literacy. How important it is that we see ourselves as change makers, as active participants in promoting peace, in learning and understanding one another in this sort of contextual cultural studies approach. You spoke about this cultural studies approach. How does it inform the way we explore rituals and practices?
Very important question. Let me take a common sort of way in which Islam is defined. Very often Islam is defined, or Muslim is defined, as one who follows the 5 pillars. How often do we hear this, right? All the time. And you see it in all the textbooks everywhere. Now, what is interesting, you go back to the Quran, is the notion of the 5 pillars and Islam equals 5 pillars even in the Quran? It's not. The individual components of the 5 pillars are, like, for example, fasting and going on pilgrimage and so on and so forth. But none of them are an aggregate and said, these are the pillars. So there's no formulation in the Quran about pillars of Islam, because the Quranic notion of Islam, as I've mentioned, is much, much broader. Now, so then we start questioning, where did this come up from? And people who've done research on this says, well, it comes from the Hadith. It's not from the Quran, it's from the Hadith. And when you start exploring the Hadith, you find, yes, there is in fact a Hadith that talks about Islam as a 5 pillars. But then there are other Hadith that talk about Islam as 3 pillars and 4 pillars and 6 pillars. Then you say, and some of the pillars are quite different. So for example, some Hadith talk about looking after your parents as a pillar. So then the question becomes, who decided to exclude looking after your parents as a pillar from the 5 pillars? There are Hadith that talk about these pillars in different ways. Why is it that this 5-pillar one attained hegemony and popularity? Who is behind it? How is this related to issues of power? So just to give you to contrast this, as we know, when the Fatimids came to rule Egypt, and it was the first time that a Shia dynasty came into power and had an empire, and they had to then express what their ideas were about Islam in terms of ritual practice and so on. And obviously, because of their Shia background and because of the importance of the Imam, you had Qadi Noman in his work Daim al-Islam talks about 7 pillars, not 5. And the 7 pillars included walaya, love and devotion to the Prophet. Now, what is interesting is that how come people don't know about the 7 pillars of Islam as defined by Qadi Noman? Well, that's because history is told from the perspective of the victorious. The Fatimids lasted only for a little while. If they had been there for centuries and they became dominant, today we would be talking about 7 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam came to be associated with the Sunni perspective, whereas the 7 at that time, right? So 7 was the Fatimids, 5 were the Sunni, Abbasids, and so on and so forth. So what you find is that even these definitions of pillars is embedded in a political context. Yes, there's theology and there's doctrine, but there's politics in there too. And today, when you see about, well, you have 5 pillars being discussed everywhere, you can say, well, whose Islam is being represented? Why is this version of Islam? How did it become dominant? Right? So what role does when communities get marginalized or get oppressed, what happens to their ideas about Islam? They're totally silenced.
Yeah, no, I think this notion of dynamic or evolution of time and understanding the various contexts and situating and being able to understand that how this shapes throughout history and has been shaping through contemporary times. What we also find for centuries is this, spread of misinformation or conflicting claims made about Islam in particular. As the world becomes more connected, these claims become more believable and widespread, and you talked about some of those. Where does this misinformation come from? Can you elaborate a little bit further on?
That's actually, Ahmed, that can be a whole lecture in itself. But since we are talking about representations of Islam, a person who comes very much to, for me, in this comes to mind is the figure of Muhammad Arkoun, who passed away several years ago. I'll just share a slide with you so people. This Muhammad Arkoun was connected actually with the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and he was actually on the board of governors of the IAS. So, in a certain way, it's nice continuing his legacy. But he questioned, when he was talking about representations of Islam, he made a distinction called, but he said that really the Islam of faith, how ordinary Muslims relate with God, the transcendent, the private personal relationship that they have, it's been silent. So in media, political, and social spaces, the Islam that gets represents, he calls the loud Islam. And that loud Islam is very often the one that is seen exclusively as an ideology of power and control by political elites, and concerning with definitions of orthodoxy, what is correct doctrine, what is incorrect doctrine, deciding who belongs and who doesn't belong. It's about issues of power, identity, and control. He says that the media, political, and social spaces today are dominated by the discourse, including in the academy. So much so that in many policy circles, Islam has come to be seen just as a political ideology. Just give you an example. Michael Flynn, who was the national security, the national security advisor, once claimed that Islam was not even a religion; it was a political ideology hiding behind the skirts of religion. This is how, and that, in fact, based on that Muslims were, in fact, all political agents, and that's why they should be surveilled by the state. This is the consequence of this kind of thing. Whereas silent and silenced Islam is the one, the Islam of ordinary believers, and how they see their faith. And they're not interested in politics and identity and so on. For them, Islam is an experience. And that experience is very often, as I would say, embedded in the art. So we have to then distinguish between, what's being, which Islam are we talking about? Yeah?
While it's worrisome, of course, that these notions exist today, where there are manifestations of this religious illiteracy. I think that when you mention the word majority, there should be some sort of unity and confidence that there are individuals out there that are fostering. So, one that comes to mind is the role that art, architecture, and music of the Muslim societies and civilizations that play a role in fostering that religious literacy, and while silent, making a lot of noise, positive noise.
But in an interesting way. So I would say that this representation of Islam with ideologies of power, right? Not just a connection that is coming out from Western source. There are Muslims who do think about Islam as power, and they have constructed a whole theology of power around it. And and I think some of these theologies are arrogant because they assume that they know what is the right way, and they're sort of playing God, in a sense, in assertions of power. And so when non-Muslims pick up these notions, some of it is because there are these notions, these expressions of power. What non-Muslims are very often not aware of is that, in fact, the arts and aesthetics are very central to the Islamic tradition. So I'll share with you my screen again. So let's think about the Quran. We think about the Quran as a book. But at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there was no book. The Prophet used to recite the Quran, and people would flock to listen to that. And listening to the Quran was an experience. And people would weep and cry. It was the beauty of the text, the aesthetics of the text that moved people. Again, it was an oral text to be recited. And you see this in the Quran itself. It talks about that this is a text to be experienced. And so here it talks about that it causes the skin of those, associated, of those, to shiver, and their hearts soften at the mention of God. We know, for example, how the second caliph, who became the second caliph, Omar, had a big conversion moment when he heard a beautiful recitation of the Quran. And he, who was the most adamant opponent of the Prophet, had this change of my heart because he had this incredible experience of the Quran. And in fact, you see, even today, we have a Quran, an Iranian scholar talking about that, the Arab, and this is interesting, the discourse that he's imagining at the time of the Prophet, that it was the oratory of the Quran, the beauty of its language that transformed individuals, that the words felt like rays of light, and the listener found himself immersed in light. And that that illuminated his heart and mind. So the Quran was a light that shone into the soul through the aperture of the ear, and it transformed the soul. Now, when you start thinking about the Quran as an experience, then you realize, yes, there's the sound, but then there's also the calligraphy. So it was a visual text to be appreciated through the arts of calligraphy. And we can talk a lot about this, but what we find actually, if you think about that, at the heart of Islam is beauty and aesthetics, which is a viewpoint that has been marginalized, that you see that Muslims have always engaged with their faith through the arts. The arts have been the primary way in which Muslims have understood the faith. So for example, poetry. Poetry, not that is read, but poetry is performed with music and so on, was the primary way in which Muslims related to, understood their faith. So Rumi's is just one example. Rumi's Masnavi, was the primary way in which Persian speakers even understood what the inner meaning of the Quran was. And so what we have here is what I'm calling theopoetics, where people understood through performed poetry and music their faith, in which you had a fusion of the aesthetic, the ethical, the intellectual, and the spiritual. So most people were not understanding Islam through works of theology and doctrine and so on. They were experiencing the Islam, let's say the silenced Islam, even though it's loud, but we have silenced it because they're silenced from our ears. That this was the primary way in which the tradition was transformed. And this is why, even today, you find the primary way, doesn't matter what part of the world you're in, ordinary people's experience of religion is based on the arts. And therefore, it becomes very important for us to think about that Islam, it's interesting that Islam, a tradition that emerged in aesthetics and in beauty and experiencing God through these notions of beauty, has in fact been vulgarized by those who create violence in the name of the same tradition. So there's the Islam of beauty and the vulgarization of the tradition by people, who are interested in Islam as an ideology of power and dominance, and unfortunately, violence.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, earlier you spoke about walaya, right? This love and devotion to the Prophet and to the Imam. As we know, Maulana Hazir Imam has invested tremendously in the beauty and aesthetics through the Aga Khan Development Network, through the Jamaati institutions, and continuously reminding us of those responsibilities of bringing sort of this that is silent, right, out in such a way that it manifests this beauty and reminds us of one's duty towards one another. And I think it's such a great way to, sort of remind us that there are many different interpretations, different traditions, but how do we begin to build that unity, build those bridges with hope, with confidence, with compassion. At this time, what I'd like to do is see if the audience wishes to learn more about religious literacy. As you said, there's so many courses, so many readings, and so many lectures that we can have on this. What resources would you recommend? Are there any projects that foster religious literacy that the audience can reflect further in?
Yes, there are actually several initiatives. I will just mention a few that I've been involved in, but people can explore. I mean, there is a course that's offered through Harvard X. It's Qur'an through its scriptures. I think the link to that, will be posted on chat. And then there are several other publications. There's Diane Moore's work, Overcoming Religious Illiteracy. I've written some chapters on this issue about religious illiteracy, but I've also written more recently about Islam, arts, and pedagogy. And one of the interesting thing about thinking about Islam through as an aesthetic tradition, sort of to balance out, the theologies of power, you have to know both. I'm not saying we ignore these theologies of power because they are problematic and we have to think about them. But there are these other traditions that have been lost. But the aesthetics have a way of drawing people together. So, you enter a building like the Taj Mahal, and remember, all around the Taj Mahal are Quranic verses. The building is supposed to represent a Quranic vision. And people are so struck with its beauty, they don't realize that the beauty itself is inspired by Quranic verses and Quranic ideas. So in a certain way, it's a manifestation of Quranic notions of paradise, right? But very often people don't see it in that light.
Hopefully, a Quranic verse that comes to mind is where Allah says, my mercy encompasses all. So, hopefully we can remain in His grace at all times. So we've just shared those resources. So thank you, Dr. Asani. Thank you so much for these reflective thoughts. You beautifully presented the importance of the contextual cultural studies approach and methods, and how it is critical in helping us think about religion and learn about one another. How it is important that we take the time to recognize and counter those manifestations of religious illiteracy. The examples you shared were insightful in how people experience religion, particularly Islam, in a diversity of ways. In order for us to truly live in a pluralistic society, we must challenge ourselves to be more generous, inclusive, just, compassionate, and caring. I'm reminded of a well-known hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him and his family, where he says, "My servant continues to draw near to me with voluntary acts so that I shall love him. When I love him, I am his hearing with which he hears, his seeing with which he sees, his hand with which he holds, and his foot with which he walks." The role that ethics of our faith can play in informing and governing how we learn about one another, understand one another, and inspire hope instead of fear, genuine compassionate dialogue and empathy instead of judgment, and become more religiously literate. With everything that has been spoken about, we have received many questions from our audience, which I'm sure we would love to hear your insights upon. With that, let's turn to our first question. Yeah. All right, so here we go. Right. Religious illiteracy, particularly in the West, is often brought about and sometimes promoted for sensationalistic reasons via mainstream and TV media. Do you have recommendations on responsible media consumption for Ismailis?
Yes, so I would say, first of all, this notion of religious illiteracy, certainly it's there in the media and how, media will, the way they represent Muslims and so on. And there are many, many sort of groups that are fighting against that for responsible media presentations of Muslims. And I would certainly say that the media are very sensitive to public opinion, and especially at a time today where we talk about racism and inclusion and so on. This is the perfect time that if you see something that you feel is misrepresenting viewpoints, this is a certain time to point them out. And I think do it in a very, not in an angry way, but in a very reasoned, that this is just wrong and that you should not be perpetuating that. But I would also say that religious illiteracy is not just a problem with the West or non-Muslims and Muslims. There is religious illiteracy amongst Muslims themselves about other Muslims. So when we talk about intra-Muslim relations or intra-share relations and so on, there are stereotypes of other people. I think there are many Ismailis who have stereotypes of Sunnis, and they have stereotypes of other Shias. And the way in which we need to be able to engage in pluralism and engage in understanding other viewpoints is actually to study them. We don't necessarily have to accept, or give up different opinions or different interpretations. So engaging in trying to learn these differences and learn these traditions doesn't mean that everything is just going to become one sort of monolithic whole. Not at all. In fact, pluralism and understanding pluralist viewpoints is in fact highlighting difference and how you can use difference to understand each other. So I would say that this idea of religious literacy is not just an issue about Muslims and non-Muslims, non-Muslims learning about Islam, but also Muslims learning about other faith traditions. But also important is Muslims learning about other Muslim traditions as well. So it is both interfaith and intrafaith.
Wonderful. I think as you were discussing this, it seems that it requires time, it requires effort, and it requires hard work for us to be able to do these things. It's not something that simply happens. Another question we have from the audience is, when we think about the dynamic of our society today, where it seems that answers should be instant, simple, and Googleable, it seems like an interesting word, Googleable. How do you see the way we educate ourselves and engage with others shifting to intellectually process these concepts and engage in conversations with others?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think the fact that the person talked about Google, you cannot become religiously literate by relying on the internet and going Googling things, because those, you have to remember that those are perspectives, often individual, often institution, and you have to have, I would say, literacy, media literacy, to figure out who's writing this, why are they writing this, what's the agenda. Don't take anything that's out there on the internet at the face value. Sometimes people claim they're authoritative, but very often they're not. But the internet has given the power, and print culture has given the power of anybody to pose themselves as an expert. What is important is that to be literate about religion is a concerted, lifelong process. As you intimated earlier, I think how to think critically about religion has to be part of educational systems. And yes, you can talk about even people who are secular need to understand the role of religion in human civilization, and they need to know how to think critically about religion. In fact, in a case that was brought to the United States Supreme Court about can religions be taught in school, and they said, yes, you need to be able to teach about religion in schools, because human civilization, they played a very important role in human civilization in terms of literature and the arts and so on. Many works of art or music or cannot be understood without religion. So it has to be, it has to be embedded, not as a special subject, but embedded in the studies of social sciences and humanities, how you think about religion. But it has to start really from, I would say, early childhood, all the way till you're an adult. It's an ongoing process. You're always learning. And there's never an end to the amount that you can learn on this topic. Because the more you read, the more you learn things. And I myself have evolved and changed my ideas about this topic. And I still think maybe 5 years from now, I'll have different ideas. So it's a journey.
Absolutely, and very important. And as you were going through this, I'm just thinking about our religious education centers and the system that we have, and how, as educators and as students and as stakeholders, parents, management teams, how we can reflect on this and begin to ensure that it is embedded, it is part of our educational system, so that as our students engage in this from the youngest, and as they grow into the system, that they build on that religious literacy and those skills and those critical thinking characteristics that we would want, so that they can reflect and be part of this society in a much more meaningful, thoughtful, and compassionate way. Last question, but it's got multiple sections to this question, so bear with me, Dr. Asani. You talked about the notion of theopoetics that brings together intellectual, aesthetic, spiritual, and ethical. What role does social cohesion and communal have? Is the social or communal all-encompassing of the other aspects? I'll actually pause here, and then let me just let me just read the rest of the questions, and then you can take it on. So is the social or communal all-encompassing of the other aspects? How does education in a plural society for Muslims and all peoples help to animate intellectual, aesthetic, spiritual, ethical, and social aspects that are shared yet animated plurally? How does this perspective thus inform how arts are taught, particularly in a dominantly Western education context?
All right, so Ahmed, that's a question that's going to take at least half an hour, and we don't have the half an hour. I would have loved to talk about, all these different aspects. So I'm just going to, address like the first question, and maybe say a few words about the last part of it. The social dimension of this, when you're talking about these traditions of theopoetics, where religious traditions are transmitted in, using this fusion of the arts and ethics and morality, it does have a social dimension, because very often you'll have communities building themselves and their identities around these traditions. So for example, take the Ginans. The Ginans are a wonderful example of theopoetics, but the Ginans have become a tradition, a performative tradition, around which today, of course, we are drawing Ismaili identity. We look at them as Ismaili texts, but in the past, they were part of what was the Satpanth tradition. And it drew upon traditions, the Bhakti tradition, the Sikh tradition, and so on. And there were many communities who were not Ismaili, who were part of the Satpanth tradition, and with whom we shared Ginans. Now, today we've tended to think about the Ginans as exclusively Ismaili. However, there are many communities in India are singing the same Ginans as we're singing, but they are interpreting those Ginans within different theological frameworks. So the idea is that these traditions of theopoetics can create social identity and social adhesion, because certain community, they can become the focus, the focal point of different identity making, if you will. And those identity markers keep on changing. So at one point, the Ginanic tradition was much broader. So you had to talk about Satpanth. The Ginans don't even talk about the word Ismaili, they talk about Satpanth. And what was Satpanth? It was a broad a movement that incorporated people from many, many different traditions. And it's only over time that it became at least narrowed to an Ismaili, the way we look at it. But there are Imam Shahis and there are other sort of groups that are all still using the Ginan, and they don't see themselves Ismaili. So we do have to keep that in mind. And I think in terms of that last question, in terms of I think, was it the arts and pluralism? Yeah.
So it, how does for the arts and pluralism, yes. So how does education and how does this perspective thus inform how arts are taught, particularly in a dominantly Western education context?
Well, again, I think it's very important that when we teach about religion, because religions are multisensory experiences, that, you know, the way we teach about religion has to include the arts. You can't exclude them. So we can't talk about religion is just about doctrines, belief, and practices. Religion is about experience. And again, I would emphasize this is not just an issue about the West. This is an issue also about Muslim societies. Muslim societies have undermined, or I think they underplay the role of the arts in the formulation of faith perspectives. Islam is just in religious education systems in many parts of the world. Religion is just seen as an ideology of identity. Nation states have taken over the religious curricula of schools and are promoting nationalist ideologies in the name of Islam, and the aesthetics is just totally marginalized. So this is a huge crisis because people are actually denying their aesthetic, their roots of aesthetics and spirituality, which is, again, as I would say, is at the heart of Islam. And that's where I would say, you know, this notion is equally applicable to Muslim societies as well.
I know, no, absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Asani. You've given us a lot to think about. And I think just based on some of the conversations we were having today, that there are many other topics and other discussions to be had. So I think on behalf of Critical Conversations, we would love to invite you and have you back once again. With that, you know, Dr. Asani, thank you so much for a thoughtful discussion. I think, you know, it's been a wonderful treat for all of us. We also want to thank the audience for taking the time and joining us today. Hopefully, this is just the start of a critical conversation. And as we, you know, look towards the month of Ramadan, that, you know, the experience and the important ideas and notions that you've put out there for us to reflect on allow us to enter this month in a much more positive and thoughtful way. With that, just a couple of announcements before we go. To view a recording, I know there have been a lot of questions around this, so to view a recording of this session and past critical conversations, please visit the Facets of Faith page on the.ismaili USA, which is copied and pasted in the chat box. Also, the resources that Dr. Asani has shared, again, are copied and pasted, which include the online course, the edX course that he talked about, the Islam through its scriptures, and 3 of the readings, Overcoming Religious Illiteracy by Diane Moore, Enhancing Religious Literacy in a Liberal Arts Education through the Study of Islam and Muslim Societies, and Islam, Arts, and Pedagogy by Dr. Ali Asani. And we'll share these with you as well. And please look out for more information on the Ismaili USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations and reading circles this week and our next critical conversation. Please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. Dr. Asani, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all. Yali Madat and Ramadan Mubarak.